Thank you very much, Alice. Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight and to be able to introduce our event this evening. On behalf of the Hong Kong Baptist University Centre for Translation, which, as you've just heard, is co-hosting this event, I'd like to welcome you all to this evening. I think it's going to be a fascinating discussion. At the Centre for Translation, we host a monthly translation studies seminar around about this time every month. Usually that takes place on the Hong Kong Baptist University campus. But for this month, we thought we would try something a bit different, and very pleased to be teaming up with the Asia Society tonight. To give you something that is different, I think, both in terms of the format as a dialogue and the content, rather different from what we normally do. So what we have tonight then is a dialogue between three speakers that brings them together to talk about and around the issue of what's known as cultural translation. Now, I know we have a lot of translation studies people in the audience. I can see quite a lot of my colleagues here tonight. But just to sort of try to give a bit of a definition, I think cultural translation is a term that implies a much broader definition of translation than we're perhaps normally used to thinking about. And it takes the translation concept well beyond the domain of language. Becomes more a metaphor for cross-cultural interactions, for the complex forms of hybridity that arise when two cultures meet, and as well for travel and migration across cultures. And you may be familiar with that quote from Salman Rushdie, who said himself that he was a translated man. So that sense of broader cross-cultural interactions is signalled by the subtitle of our event tonight, Speaking to You About Me, in which two auteurs from different cultures, both of whose work seeks in various different ways to explore cross-cultural interactions, border crossings, and so forth, come to exchange views in an intercultural dialogue. Well, let me give a little bit of introduction on our speakers tonight. Firstly, Pema Tseden is a leading filmmaker of Tibetan descent from the Amdo region of Qinghai Province in China. And he was educated in Qinghai and Beijing. And as an auteur in the cinema, he's won major international prizes with films including The Silent Holy Stones and Old Dog. His short stories are sometimes written in Tibetan, sometimes in Chinese, and they've captured international attention and have been translated into various languages, including English, German, French, Czech, and Japanese. I know we have the Japanese translator with us here today. And others too as well. He's also a prolific literary translator of Tibetan literature into Chinese. Hong Kong filmmaker Evans Chan, our second guest tonight, lives between Hong Kong and New York, making films and writing about Hong Kong for international audience and readership. And for over 3 decades, Evans Chan has made both independent fiction and documentary features to explore key moments of Hong Kong and global Chinese history. And his films, including To Live and 2 or 3 Things About Kang Yo Wei, have been shown in major international film festivals and received critical acclaim. Finally, our moderator tonight, Professor Robert Barnett, is director and founder of the Tibet Studies program at Columbia University. His numerous articles include studies of modern Tibetan history, post-1950s leaders in Tibet, Tibetan cinema and TV, which I think is going to be of relevance tonight. Women in politics in Tibet, and then also, rather interestingly, contemporary exorcism rituals. Maybe he can say more about that later. His books include Tibetan Modernities, Notes from the Field, written in 2008, and Lhasa Streets with Memories, from 2006. So let me bring these remarks to a close then by giving my sincere thanks to all of the people involved in making this possible. I'd particularly like to thank Alice Mong, Executive Director of the Asia Society Hong Kong, and all those at the Asia Society who have given such generous support and provided us with such a wonderful venue tonight. I think it's just the right venue for a dialogue such as this. I'd also like to thank, I'm not sure where she is, but anyway, Dr. Jessica Young of the Centre for Translation. She's probably hiding somewhere. From HKBU. She's been really a big part of the inspiration behind this, and taking a lot of time out for the planning of it as well. So thank you very much to everyone involved. And of course, thank you very much to our three speakers, our participants tonight in advance, and to all of you for your participation at this event. So without further introduction, I'm going to invite our speakers to come up and take a seat, and then I'll hand it over to Professor Barnett. Thank you very much.
Welcome everybody to this dialogue, and of course I'd like to thank Rob and the Asia Society and Jessica, who's hiding up there and waving at us from the translation box, for making this dialogue possible. And it's a very special kind of dialogue, not so much because of the subject, translation, which I think is an intrinsic part of the lives of everybody in this room who's from Hong Kong. But especially because the two artists we're talking to tonight are people who have made translation the subject of their art as well as the method of their work. And both of them have produced work in which translation is at the core of the project. When we think about Evans, Chan's films, they're films which mutate during their own course, from being documentary to being theatre, to being back to being documentary, to being realist, to being non-realist, and he's even in his next incarnation, I think in the spring, he's turning one of his films, That Old Great Society, into an opera. So we can see that kind of extraordinary flexibility of medium. That really is part of his meaning, I think. Part of his ability to make us think beyond the categories and the confines that we're used to, and constantly challenging us in his work to look at reflections of one reality in a different kind of mirror. Pema Tseden's work is also very unique. You know, in at least two of his films we see operas. In some of the films we see a film in The Search, we see a film of a director looking for an actor to make a film that he never makes. We see in his first major film, Silent Holy Stones, we see a film about a boy who wants to watch television that he only is able to see part of before the television is taken away. We see constant interplay between media in his work as well. I see their work really, I see it as forms of humour, dry humour, a kind of wit, that's really quite special and very much a comment on the modern project. And it's a wit that moves between cultures. So these are some of the issues that I want to prompt our two guests to talk about. But I'm going to begin by asking both of you questions that are quite preliminary, quite almost about the beginnings, where translation first comes into your lives. So maybe I'm going to ask Evans first. Evans, what was the first language in which you started to write, and when did it move towards being about a second language?
I start now. I guess well, what have I tried to say? I actually have translated mainly one person so far, which is Susan Sontag. I've translated some Nadine Gordimer some time ago, but it's not very much. But that was really a long time ago. I started translating Susan's project for a trip to China. So she went to China during the Cultural Revolution, but actually she wrote that story before she visited. And then she never wrote another thing about China. But actually, I mean, now I find out that in her papers now, she has written a screenplay about China. That was, his biographer has been in touch with me now, so we were having some discussion about that. And then I translated another, one major essay of hers, Fascinating Fascism. Later that I know, years later, I would end up writing this paper on Zhang Yimou's Hero. It's called Zhang Yimou's Hero and the Temptation of Fascism, which has provoked very strong reaction and has been rebutted by papers after papers, and I almost seen a whole book be written or edited to rebut my thesis. In any way, I think I was the first person to come up with sort of a comparison between Zhang Yimou and Lenin reference style. But I feel that I've often been misquoted in the sense that I said that Zhang Yimou is the closest thing to being the Lenin reference style of China, because you cannot compare China to fascist Germany anyway. I mean, it's not Nazi Germany. No matter how dissatisfied we are with China today, it is not. So I mean, in that sense that Zhang Yimou is not really Lenin reference style, even though, I'm exploring the aesthetics, the construction of modern nationalism, etc. So that kind of feed into my work in terms of how I approach the subject of my work. So that was one strand of my translation activity. Is still ongoing. I hope that I can find more time to do that, but when you're making films it's very consuming.
Well, I can see you're already translating from one question to a different question. It's your natural mobility of your mind. But let me ask Pema the same kind of question. Pema, when you first started writing, what language were you writing in? And when did you decide to start writing in a different language?
我其实就是翻译的时间比较早，就是大概在场的罗仁清也知道，我们从小学开始就接受这个双语的教育，然后到大概高中的时候，也能接触到很多的这个藏文的，然后汉语的这样一些文学作品。所以写作其实很早，就是大概17、18岁的时候，大概在上高中的时候，你就能用这个就开始用双语来写作。但是那时候不知道，就是我觉得只是一个表达，就是写作只是一个表达，纯粹的一个表达。我的处女作就有一篇小说叫《人与狗》，这个小说其实在高中毕业之后，我们是一个师范学校，然后就到一个乡村当老师，在那一段时间我完成了我的这个第一部小说。然后后来就上了大学，然后上了大学之后有这个写作的课嘛，就把这个短篇小说拿出来 给老师看，然后老师觉得可以投到一个杂志社，然后这样就尝试着去投，然后没想到就是第2学期就收到了这个发表的这个刊物，所以双语写作我觉得对我来说是同时的，就是同一年大学1年级的时候就有了这个汉语和藏语的这样一个作品发表，但是关于翻译，我觉得在藏区可能每一个藏族人都会面临到这个双翻译的问题，无论你是一个上过学有一定文化基础的人，或者你完全没有上过学，就像我小时候特别喜欢看电影，然后因为那时候还没有这个翻译的这样一些电影，所以你只能就是小时候肯定不会懂里面的很多台词，它的意思不懂，但是有些词汇或者有些话你记住了，然后你就要问这个大一点的人或者老师，第2天去问这个什么意思。然后我觉得从那时候就开始了这个翻译，然后也是等自己稍微长大以后，别人也会问我这样的问题，所以对我来说，就是翻译不是一个光是一个文字的翻译，包括可能方言之间的翻译，包括藏语之间的翻译。有时候因为那个藏区它用方言的这个区别，有3大藏区，所以有很多人那个你到拉萨的时候，他们说的是这个拉萨的方言，但是在我们这个家乡安多的时候是用的是安多的方言，然后在康区用的是康区的方言，所以有时候大家聚在一起，然后如果一个人用这个拉萨方言说，但是在场如果有其他的，比如说这个安多的人，他从来没有接触过这个拉萨的方言的话，我可能就会用这个安多方言给他做一个翻译。包括就是汉语也是，我后来2002年到北京之后，就是有时候我的家乡的同事他们也是讲汉语的，但是可能他们的汉语比较接近这个青海的方言，所以他们有些事情跟别人讲，他们就是讲了半天，他们自己是在用汉语讲，就是有一个事情可能要向某个人反映，但是他讲了半天，讲了10几分钟，然后那个人是突然说他听不懂，他就说他刚刚讲了什么，你能不能给我翻译一下？我觉得对翻译在藏区在藏族人中间是无所不在的，包括可能对我来说就更广泛一些，包括后来这个做了电影之后，电影的字幕又要翻译，就是首先是因为要审查嘛，所以首先你用藏语思考这个台词，然后你必须把它翻译成这个汉语，然后还要准确的传达这个信息，写成剧本之后，最后就是完成片之后，你还要根据那个人的情绪、他的表情、他的动作、他的当时的一个处境，还要做一些处理。所以包括自己读了这个翻译专业之后，就是从事专业的这种文学翻译。所以对我来说，翻译确实是我生活的一部分。
Evans, when you made your first film, I think To Live, what made you decide to make that a multilingual film?
Yeah, I think at times I forgot I switched. You know, for example, when I first talked about I translated Sontag's piece, Fascinating Fascism, from English into Chinese, and years later I wrote my pieces already. I'm writing in English. I attended Baptist U, and my major was in English journalism. That's before I turned to filmmaking, but then very quickly I became involved in writing about the arts and culture and film. And then I was very close to the film department. I started taking film classes and a little filmmaking, but mostly film appreciation, and quickly I became a staff film writer for then the Standard, which was a bigger paper at the time. And then I left Hong Kong. I was at the point of becoming a TV journalist. I felt that I just want to go somewhere else. And while in Hong Kong, in New York, I went to the New School for Social Studies. I became a philosophy major. My advisor, Jerome Khan, was Hannah Arendt's last teaching assistant. And he saw some of my writing. He said, "Oh, he saw Arendt's influence on me, blah blah blah." So that I got a scholarship. I went, and I wasn't really thinking about filmmaking. I've been thinking. I've written some short stories, but I've always wavered. There was that urge in me, but I feel that narration didn't come to me. And slowly dawned on me because my native language is Cantonese. And coming to written Chinese, I never have any problems in terms of writing, that kind of critical discursive writing. But then when you're writing in dialect, it's not considered literature. So for the longest time, I think that there was this prejudice against Hong Kong not being literary, not being cultural. Has to do with it has to do with the status of the language, because it is a subpart, so to speak, subpart language, is a dialect. It is not literary. I feel that slowly I was drawn, and then later on I figured out am I more attracted into filmmaking? It's because you never have to apologize for what you speak in film. You always are. I can speak in dialects, and then you subtitle it, and people subtitle it into sort of standard Chinese, and then you subtitle it into English, and then so you already in that mode of operation. I already was feeling that I'm translating Hong Kong culture, and of course the evolution of Hong Kong literature is different. My current film, Dong Qijang began to use much more Cantonese in his work, etc. And then become a political question, even in terms of being published in China. He has some problem publishing in China because he was told that he's to Hong Kong, it's become sensitive or something. So there is that reason that I am slowly dawned on me why I became drawn to filmmaking, and also I feel that I am not into description. So no matter how much I'm fond of reading novels, and I read quite a bit. I was a very avid fiction reader. I read Henry James, Joseph Conrad, to through translation, the existentialist, to Dostoevsky, Tolstoy. That was in my youth. That was as a teenager in my early 20s. I read a lot of fictions. But then I always feel that because of that feeling, I always feel that I was going to become a novelist. But no, I wasn't. And then I realized that I'm more like a playwright. And then screenwriting is another form of telling story. So when I made To Live, it was in the shortly after 1989. Tiananmen happened. I was traveling through China. During June 4th, I was in China, not in Beijing. I left Beijing in late May, thinking that it's just a waiting game, nothing will happen. By June 4th, I was in Hangzhou, and then it was a total shock. I left China like in a convoy. It was pretty serious at the time. People, if you were in China during that time, you would think a civil war was going to erupt. Anyway, I left. And I was back in Hong Kong, I was back in New York, and then one day I read the New York Times. I noticed that Liv Ullmann went to Hong Kong. It was like, just 6 months later, he came to Hong Kong, and he started, yelling and screaming, not exactly, but he was really condemning Hong Kong for being inhumane, of expatriating the Vietnamese refugees, etc. And then I thought, it was all of a sudden I saw Hong Kong in this vice of multinational politics. Vietnam was definitely American problem. All these refugees are being dumped at the doorsteps of Hong Kong, and Hong Kong was supposed to take them unconditionally. And then, somebody came in and tell you, and then a lot of them turned out to be economic migrants, etc. And then, some policy was put in place. And then, you look at all these border issues, and I don't know, just somehow something in me just react. So how else to respond to an actress accusation than by making a movie? And so I don't know. I mean, I just wrote a screenplay in a month.
But what language did you write in?
It was writing in both languages. All the letters to Liv Ullmann were written in English. So to Levin, of course, I mean, then people who are more familiar with film scholarship realize that, of course, that was a takeoff from Jean-Luc Godard's film Letters to Jane, to Jane Fonda about her visit to Vietnam, etc. So I mean, there was that loose interaction. All my films have some loose interaction with Godard, like Two or Three Things If I Count Your Ways, of course, and Godard's Two or Three Things, yeah. But not so literal, of course. I mean, it just is part of my background, I guess. I mean, just suddenly film critic in me pop up, and suddenly I just feel that all the stories that I heard at that time suddenly came together and merged. So I wrote a screenplay in a month. I took a filmmaking workshop. I raised the money, and I made the film. So I cannot really tell people how, I mean, so I'm like, even today, as I'm always an outsider to every discipline, and I dabble my hand in it, and then I have some fun. So I guess that's okay.
We're going to, I think, show a clip from one of your films a bit later on, but before we do that,
yeah.
I want to show a clip from one of Pema's films, which directly talks about the question of language, in which Pema, in Pema's films, there's very, very little of what you could call statement. The concepts, the messages, you really have to work to see what those might be, and they're constantly in a play of appearing and disappearing. You never quite know. Maybe that may have changed in his most recent film, but the first three films are like that. I want to show a little clip where there is something which is maybe like a statement in his first film, which is Mani Dogu, Jingjing Da Manisha, which is a film about a... Pema, why don't you tell us? What is the story of Ling Ling Mani Dogu? I'm going to show you a clip afterwards of the two brothers talking.
对，这个其实是我的处女作，之前有一个短片，然后根据短片扩成了这个小说，这个长片。然后我知道那个 Rabbit 会要给大家看什么。其实这个片段也是我当时写剧本的时候，因为有投资人嘛，所以我写完剧本之后，就是包括投资人，包括我自己，其实我们做电影其实跟写小说有点不一样，就是所以昨天那个音量。讲我的小说跟这个电影的区别的时候也是这样，可能我的小说更自由，然后涉及的面会更广，可能跟这个藏文化更接近。但是电影，他说因为审查的原因，他猜测到可能是审查的原因，所以在自己在写剧本的时候，可能会经过一个自我的审查，包括每一个句子、每一个台词，然后我写完之后还要投资人还要看，所以他要那个。准备让大家看的这个片段是我们当时也是很担心的一个片段吧，就是因为里面的台词，我觉得先可以让大家看看，然后再探讨这个问题。
Çünkü hangi tarafını sır? Da sirgir. Da khinajini lakshana apatali gyana kchi sinimatmeri. İşte sirgir mundar. Maçı sirgir ne da zakını kostu hito. Nanda suguru. Da jayrin da khinajini tonchu chimo yutumri. Jayrin tum. 沙市的春，弯弯的月儿，沙市的春，沙市的春儿两头尖。我在沙市的船里坐，只看见山上的星星蓝蓝的天。你们怎么去呢？前天的这个跟你说下一个速度可是那里。Yolun tutuğuna gitse, teorikine döreni. Çetin toptaki çocuk, gerçek çocuklar. O senden olmaz aga. Çekse, ama çekim için aşı olduğunu bulunca. Ne olsun tam, daha zaman mıhkı olsun büyük. Da zamanı, ne için yemeğe fırsatı olduğunu bulunca. Ne marka? Ki o yüzden çekti. Ne mıhkı? O yekine çeyme anlatımları. Ne iki tane anlatık o? Nazını konuşan gene anlatık. Çünkü götürmeyin. Gerçekten götürmeyin. Onu ticaret daha zor olsun. Nazını konuşan sonra koçadık o. Nga tiada tunggu di mana tu, ni akhir tentu tadi ni. Cuk, nga sini tunggu sama tu tiada sini. Dekat mana? Jangan mari, sampai ni.
There you really see the whole issue of language in Tibet today summed up in 2 minutes. Pema, tell us about that.
对，就因为这个涉及到了一个藏区的一个现实的问题，确实有一个比较嘛，这里面有一个很明显的比较，说你就是汉语跟藏语之间做的一个比较，然后因为有这样的一个比较明显的比较，当时制片人也是觉得这个可能通不过，我也是有点担心，所以他的意思就是把这个拿掉，然后我的意思是抱着试一试的希望，然后就先是就按这个剧本的样子，然后就报了上去，最后就是没想到通过了。所以我觉得还是比较幸运的吧，就包括这个片段，我觉得它里面也涉及到了一个翻译的问题。就刚刚开场的时候我讲的，就是翻译可能在藏族人的生活中，在当下它是一个他的生活的一部分。就比如说这个小弟弟，他念了一段这个他的课文里面的汉语的这个有点诗歌的这样一个小片段，然后小喇嘛马上就问他这是什么意思，然后他马上就翻译给他听。我觉得翻译确实是就是充满在当下的藏族人的生活当中，然后这个就是我希望一方面是用这样一个比较小的片段，这样一个很短的对话来展现，就是展示那个藏语的当下的一个处境，然后另一方面也是这个里面同时还有那个什么。就是这个电影里面我也用了，如果懂藏语的话，就是尤其是安多藏语的话，我用的就是现实之中，因为现实之中因为很多新的词汇的出现嘛，所以比如说这个电视，它这个里面说你去了城市之后，我去了城市之后你想要什么，然后那个小喇嘛马上就说我想要一个电视机，我觉得这也是就是语言藏语在当下的一个处境吧，很多人就是包括在国外放的时候，很多人也问我，也提出了异议，说你为什么电视机现在也有翻译嘛，但是推广的不够，语言的这个推广的不够，词汇的推广的不够，所以在那个口语当中，大家用的是比如说就汉语的这个直接的发音，他不会把这个电视机翻译过来会比较生疏。然后大家直接就用电视或者电视机或者 VCD， 这样可能更接近那个新鲜事物的那个本质吧。所以我故意用了这样一些新的词汇在这个电影里面。对，主要就是这个意思。
I want to ask him some questions. Yeah, I feel very honored to be here today because I really admire Pema's films. Now concerning this film, I felt that at the time when I first came across it, of course your film came out after the Cup. So I don't know how many of you are aware that the Cup, that Tibetan film made by this Lama in exile is about this boy Lama who campaigned to have the Lama Street to rent a TV set so that they can watch the World Cup in the Lamasery. That film came out somewhat, I think, earlier than yours, and yours also involved, about watching TV in the Lamasery. But I feel that, at that time, I also feel that that is already Kiarostami meeting the cup, because also the Iranian film's stylistic influence seems to be evident. So tell me, have you seen number one? Have you seen the cup? And number two, at what time have you seen Kiarostami's film, and how that come to influence your work? I'm sorry I was not at the seminar yesterday. Maybe that questions have been asked.
这个对，耳机有点问题，7个人。对，我知道，基本上知道。对，那个就是不丹的尊萨仁波切的电影《卡普》，然后高山上的世界杯，看过。对对对，所以我在这个首先是一个短片，因为可能反映的主题，它设计的主题比较接近，所以里面可能有一些相似的符号，比如说电视。当时我也想到用，比如说其他的，比如说收音机啊什么的。这个小喇嘛他在寺院里面，他的师傅就有一个收音机，然后这也是一个符号，但是可能电视的这个符号性可能比其他的，比如说收音机啊这些要强，而且确实在藏区确实是一个现实。从我小时候就有强烈的这样的感情。小时候是那个看露天电影，然后后来慢慢出现，就是可能一个村庄里面只有一个电视机，然后为了看一个电视机，大家可能会跑去很远的地方，1-2个小时的路程去看一个电视剧，或者就到一个家里面，比如说全村可能就有一个电视机，大家聚在一起。所以我觉得电视是一个特别明显的符号，所以就选择了这个电视机来做一个这样的一个主要的道具。然后这个里面等一会儿还会放，就是涉及到这个《西游记》。《西游记》是在藏区是跟电视是紧密的联系在一起的。你如果它是一个80年代的一个电视剧，然后现在还在拉萨或者其他的藏区很多茶馆啊什么的，很多人还是津津有味的看那个《西游记》的这个电视剧。所以我觉得这两个，一个是电视，然后一个是它里面的这个展现的这个内容《西游记》，它是在藏区是具有一定的代表性的。然后第二个问题就是，对伊朗导演阿巴斯的电影对我有没有影响？确实是有影响。我是2002年到北京电影学院学习，以前是学的是其他专业，但是对电影有特别强烈的这个兴趣。但是之前就是没有看过太多的国外的或者就是具有经典的这个意义的这样一些电影史上的电影。到了电影学院之后，一开始2002年开始就开始系统的学习这个电影史，然后也系统的看一些电影史上提到的一些电影。大概在2003年的时候，一个偶然的机会，我看到了这个伊朗导演阿巴斯的电影，然后我对他产生了
电影谁演的？就是这样。
对，因为那时候只有 DVD 啊 VCD 嘛，然后通过老师的推荐，我看到了他的电影，然后同时也看到了其他的马卡马多夫啊他们的其他的一些伊朗导演的电影，当时确实给了我很大的启发。当时中国的电影的那个审查或者它的整个的一个生产的一个机制还不是特别开放。因为我在拍这个经济马尼什的时候，必须要挂一个厂标，私营的这个电影制片厂是不能出品电影的。所以2004年我准备这个拍经济的马尼什的时候，我们先是找了这个北京电影学院有一个青年电影制片厂， 通过他去申请一个长标，后来申请不成，又在长春电影制片厂，然后联系他们去申请这个长标。但是到2004年，我拍摄之前，已经取消了这样一个政策，就是私营的电影制片厂可以申请制作电影。所以他的这个整个的状况发生了变化。我觉得我确实受到了一些伊朗电影的影响，一方面是我觉得它的制作的规模、制作的成本，然后另一方面它对审查制度的一些规避，它的一些方法，我觉得有很多的相似性，因为它也涉及到宗教，涉及到其他的很多，比如说就是相对敏感的东西吧。我觉得确实给了我很大的启发，比如说怎么通过一些剧情，或者怎么通过一些对话来回避这个审查的这个问题。然后还有，因为少数民族题材它一直是一个边缘的题材嘛，所以怎么通过就是一个简单的，比如说你首先那个电影的创作跟小说的创作有很大的区别。电影的创作你可能在写剧本的时候你就得想到它的可能的实现性，比如说你写这样一个情节有没有可能在你允许的那个范围内实现。所以在当时的藏区电影工业是几乎是没有的，到现在也是在藏区整个西藏没有这个电影的制片厂。其他的少数民族地区，比如说新疆有这个天山电影制片厂，内蒙有这个内蒙的电影制片厂，他们也有一些自己的少数民族自己的导演，然后也生产了一些影片。但是藏区就是西藏，包括我家乡这个青海都没有这样一些制片的这样一些厂，或者制片的这样一个工业的基础，所以必须要考虑到那个现实的这个因素。所以我觉得综合就是给了我一个综合的启发，无论是题材的选择，然后包括这个制作，包括这个之外，我觉得伊朗的这个虽然是不同的文化背景、不同的宗教，但是它确实有很多相似的地方，尤其跟我这个安多的家乡的那个民俗民风有很多相似的地方，包括他们每一户人家的那种状态，包括他们的这个村庄，包括那个村庄里面的那个街道，确实对地理的位置啊、地理的形状啊、面貌啊这些，确实有很多地方。我觉得对它确实启发我，或者给了我很多借鉴，让我能够找到一个自己的方法，进入自己的这个电影的创作。
My other question is, in that case, do you, when you are writing your script, does it go through many drafts? At what point you stop and think, okay, maybe I better redo this scene, rework the dialogue? Do you show it to your friends so that you can get some feedback? And will they tell this may be a bit achy or something?
对，我觉得每一个剧本的那个生成的过程都不一样，写作的过程，有些可能是有一个小说，然后因为一个小说给你一些灵感，然后再创作。但是对我来说，这种可能比较少，就是我一般都是我写的剧本或者我拍的电影很少改编成小说，或者我自己的小说，因为拍摄之前就是拍电影之前自己也写小说，所以目前为止我自己的小说没有一个改编成电影。我都是先写这个剧本，然后再拍摄成电影。就比如我的第一部电影，今天那个刚刚 Robbie 他放的这个《静静的玛丽狮子塞伦特豪利斯通》，它确实是我的处女作，因为之前有一个短片也叫《静静的玛丽狮》，是我在上电影学院期间，然后因为我们每一个人都要就是在学习期间要有这个创作的课程。每个人都要拍摄每个学期都要拍摄这个短片，所以这个是我在学习电影期间的一个学生作业。但是后来这个短片也获得了一些奖，然后也参加了一些国际的短片电影节，然后很多老师觉得这个就是里面设计的这个题材或者它包含的这个容量可能可以做成一个长片。所以我们开始就是2004年我在电影学院毕业之后就 开始准备做这个长篇的这个剧本，但是就是单纯的一个短篇的故事，你把它扩成一个长篇，可能你人为的就是人为的往里面加一些内容，那个肯定是不行。所以我希望它是一个从短篇变成一个长篇，我觉得它是一个有机的一个过程，所以我们会做各种尝试吧。所以这个就像那个经济的马尼是这个剧本，我是前后写了大概有半年时间，而且修改了很多次，包括可能大家在这个里面看到的藏戏智美根丹这一块，原来那个短片里面是没有的，但是为了就是扩展成长篇，然后就加了这个藏戏这一块。
Actually, I want to use this point to make us think about things and words and ideas that are not translated. The phenomenon of non-translation, that I think is often very interesting. I don't know if you've ever noticed that, Evans, things where you're working on something and you decide not to translate, to refuse that option.
I don't know about that. Of course, we are always the artistic expression itself is to communicate, and maybe that translation. I mean that itself is a translation process. I think I wonder. Like Walter Benjamin's famous essay, Task of the Translator. He kind of fantasized that between all these languages, we are sort of striving toward that one pure language. I think there are issues that may or may not be transparent, and I think that there should be some, even in the creative process, one is not totally transparent to oneself. There were cases, I think that in general, people think that I'm very cerebral. So my films are also, filled with ideas or whatever. But then there are just one moment. There are all these moments you were asked why they came together that way. I really can't answer. How a story takes shape, why all these elements gel, suddenly something just gel. And so is that, how can you articulate that process? So I don't know that is what is translatable or untranslatable. The creative process itself, there is a blind spot. I think Herzog said something very interesting at one time. Your own mind, you cannot live in an apartment in which every room is lit. You will go into a dark place and sleep. And you need those dark rooms, those dark corners. And I think that one's mind functions to some extent that way. You are not totally transparent to yourself. And that's all these existential psychoanalysis problem. Because when people argue with Sartre, do you people really have absolute free will? When you are burdened with something called the unconscious. So I think that there are the untranslatability condition maybe is inherent, in us being human. And then when you come to address another culture, that is another problem. Like my film To Live, there was a misunderstanding when it first came out, and then there was a Norwegian journalist who saw my film, and then somehow the woman thought that it's a PN to her humanitarian work, and so she wrote to me and asked to see the film, and of course the next thing is she is not very happy. But anyway, so that's that impulse in me is to try to communicate and to try to make a case for Hong Kong at that point in my first film. And ever since, I think that most of my films are about Hong Kong's relationship with the world, or with the larger world. I mean, my current film, which will play at the Hong Kong Asian Film Festival on Sunday and next Friday, is about Hong Kong novelist Dong Qijiang, and I mean, his work has just been translated in French, Japanese, and English, and I interview all the 3 translators, and indicate, where Hong Kong's place is, and why there's all these obstacles that Hong Kong creative artists have to deal with, unless they're making kung fu or action spectacles, then it's a lot harder for them to negotiate with their own condition. Also being marginalized in terms of the greater Chinese sphere, so that we are always culturally ghettoized unless that you are doing certain things that is supposed to be popular and with mass appeal. So I think I always deal with that cultural issue, but then also there's the political issues in terms of, I made films about activists, the beginning of activism in Hong Kong in the 70s, like Life and Times. So there are always all these Hong Kong relationship with the outer world, but on the other hand, there's also a cultural encounter there. In each one, I feel that I look back is being staged. In my first film is with woman, a priestess of European high art coming to tell you that you are undeserving and then there's something lousy about you. And so it's East meeting West in not a very pleasant way. My second film, Crossings, is about a Chinese woman being murdered in New York subway, and again, it's another cultural encounter, and very badly. And then even in my one Asian American film, that is about cultural encounter. Sorceress of the New Piano is about Margaret Ling Tan, one Asian woman who became the leading exponent of American avant-garde music, and why is the most important interpreter of John Cage, or Henry Cow is an Asian woman, is a Chinese woman. And so that may be one of the happier instances in which, East meets West in more constructive synthesis. But, all my films are to some extent about that encounter. And when I turned to Kang Youwei, I feel that I was looking at the fountain of Chinese modernity. And Kang Youwei and Liang Qiqiao were the first 2 major Chinese intellectuals that are confronted with the whole Western world. Kang Youwei's classic, his book about Confucius as a reformer was the first book to inject the modern language to democracy in Confucian's text. And so I feel that all my films are about that kind of encounter. And in that encounter, I think Chinese culture is still evolving and groping for its way. And of course, I'm always looking in the dramatic possibility, dramatic terms in terms of how to present those stories.
So that somehow suggests to me that you're seeing modernity as a kind of translation, and that Kang Youwei and Liang Qiqiao were maybe early translators or important people who tried to translate what there was in their time into the modern. Is that right?
I think, in terms of Kang Youwei, just briefly, I don't know whether that's the topic you're interested in. That's my opera in next March at the Hong Kong Arts Festival. Now, he's the first. Just now I recently saw this article in The Economist about Occupy Central that's going on right now. And then he traced the entire tradition of student protest in China. So Kang Youwei became the first leader of student demonstration. And of course, it's 1895, there was the Gongqie Shangsu, which is meaning those days are the imperial exam candidates, who are very different from the kind of university students you encounter, because those candidates can really spend their whole life, repeatedly going to have those imperial, to attend, to take those imperial exams. But it was the elites of those days who tried to, pass the imperial exam, that submit a petition to the emperor saying that we need political change. So it was all, I feel that it's more like the original Charter 08. But that was at that time. And some people say that that was the first political movement in China. And then later, 1904, 1905, 1906, he organized all the overseas Chinese and to affect the Chinese mainland itself to stage an anti-American boycott in 1905 to the extent that Theodore Roosevelt had to meet him twice. And that was supposed to be the first massive movement. So there are all these issues, but then he was also and he, at the end of his life, he said he was trying to introduce cosmopolitanism to China, and he failed. So I think that idea of cosmopolitanism is about translation and how to import what they see as a different model of civilization or model of culture. I mean, it was a traumatic encounter at the time, but he was trying to see what is there, what can China do to bring itself out of where it was then. So I think that project translation, in terms of him interest in translated books, and he started all these press to translate Western press, Western books into Chinese, and that was a huge translation component to it. And then Lang Chichao became the first major public intellectual in modern Chinese history. He was, he became the journalist, scholar journalist, and with extensive influence, including on Mao Zedong, etc. So that was, I think, a huge project of translation at work at that point.
We're going to look at a clip from your way in a minute, but I want to take the conversation back to Pema again. And it's very interesting because Evans is talking about China really as and cosmopolitanism, the question of how to bring other languages and cultures into the modern Chinese project. But in the case of Tibet, one of the things that strikes me most about your films was that you refuse to have your films spoken in Chinese. You use subtitles. You don't let them be dubbed. And I think maybe when you did Silent Holy Stones, maybe was this the first film in China, the first feature-length film in China that was not dubbed in Chinese, that refused translation? What was your thinking when you insisted on that very unusual, very important choice?
对，其实就是从长篇说的话，这个《金节玛尼》是确实第一部用藏语拍成的那个剧情长片在中国国内播映的这样一个片子。但是之前那个草原，就是我拍的我的学生作业，我们毕业时候有一个那样的一个拍摄短片的机会，拍摄胶片的这样一个机会。然后我曾经写过一个，在毕业的时候写过一个剧本叫《草原》，一个20分钟的短片。然后这个也是用藏语拍成的。这个曾经在那个电影学院的这个大礼堂做了放映，然后后来在 CCTV6，就是电影频道也做过一个播出。所以对我来说，当时确实有一种很亲切的或者很自豪的感觉。在那样一个大的剧院里面，然后你能看到或者听到你的母语在你的主人公的从他们的嘴里说出来，确实是一种自豪。但是在拍长片的时候，确实就是官方他在审查的时候，他确实有一个要求，就是必须所有汉语之外的这个影片，包括少数民族语言拍成的影片，都要有一个汉语的普通话的这样一个配音。当时我们是做了一些坚持，就是做了一些申请，然后我们说这个必须那个首先是一个资金的问题，所以因为资金的问题，所以暂时请求就是不配这个汉语的这样一个版本，所以当时同意了。后来也就一直沿用 没有配音的这个版本。我觉得他首先是一个坚持用藏语，我觉得他是一个基本的要求，就是语言是一个对我来说，语言是一个基本的一个思维方式。必须让他的这个人物必须用他自己的语言去思维去说话，这样才能体现他们的这个生活，他们的一些本质的东西。但同时，我觉得从文本本身讲的话，就是翻译的可能性越来越大。就比如说我以前也看过很多的这个小说就是翻译的作品。可能国外的一些翻译作品，比如说国内有很多这个翻译的这样一些出版的机构，比如说上海译文出版社，或者北京的这个人民文学出版社。以前你看这些翻译的小说的时候，它有很多的注释，可能一页纸它底下有好多的那种解释，或者对一个词汇的解释。但是现在你看一个短篇小说的时候，这种主释性的这种词汇就越来越少。包括我们自己做翻译也是，以前你可能翻译一个短篇小说的时候，它会出现一些，比如说直接借用的名词，直接音译的一些名词，比如说糌粑就是一种食物，可能其他的民族，比如说汉语的读者他不懂，但是所以你必须得加一个主释。但是现在这个词汇已经很普及了，你不用主释也能很清楚地传达这个意思。所以我觉得那个翻译的可能性就是越来越大。所以我觉得尤其是电影，一般我自己的电影都是我自己来这个做这个台词的翻译。首先是有这个剧本的这个对话的这个基础，然后你拍摄完之后，再根据他们对话的一个情景，然后再做一些调整。我觉得就是英语这些我不知道是别人替我翻译的，但是汉语的这个台词的翻译，我觉得基本能传达90%以上的信息。因为影像它本身有自身的一个特点，它可能跟那个纯粹的文学翻译不一样。它通过就是你通过画面，通过一个人物的肢体语言，或者他传达的一些情绪，或者他整体的一个环境，观众可以通过影像本身能感觉到或者领略到他这个传达的一些信息。所以可能对于一个电影的这个对白的翻译来说，它可能就是准确的传达这个信息，它语言里面它对话里面这个信息可能更重要。
I want to ask a question. I hope that I can make it clear to you what my question is about. Now, of course, I mean, is your film's language is in Tibetan, and it has been, supposed to be like the first Tibetan film in China, and there's no question about that. It's the first Tibetan language film, and I am thinking, because with you here, and then we can communicate to some extent in Putonghua, etc. Is this Chinese nationhood issue? Being from, I spent a fair amount, living in New York for more than 20 years now. I always feel that we in America, you look at the nation in a sense of you acknowledge your ethnic background. So I think in a way with that American grid, I will call you the first Tibetan Chinese director. But is that idea alien to you? Because in China, I did notice that in a way that ethnic background has often been overlooked to the detriment of our understanding, even in evaluating certain artists or writers' career. like Lao She, I mean, important playwright from the 40s. Now, of course, he's known to be Manchu, and that his Manchu background has always been suppressed, to the extent that he also suppressed it himself. And then, Cui Jian, big rock star, we really will look at him as a Korean Chinese rock star. And that kind of conception of who the Chinese are is a problem. I feel that it's as though that we are hiding our ethnicity from each other, or to the extent that when we are talking our ethnicity, then that's that ethnicity which is Tibetan. Now I think that itself shows the tension within the Chinese nationhood itself, and what is traveling China and where we are today. Yeah, I mean, from all the borderland, Tibet, Xinjiang, Sichuan, to the extent even today in Hong Kong. So, has it ever occurred to you there is such a thing as a Tibetan Chinese filmmaker?
我觉得这是一个对我来说是一个很复杂的问题吧。可能包括很多藏族作家，包括阿来，他也在很多场合表示，就是很多时候给他会有一个标签嘛，就比如说这个藏族作家阿来，但是他特别反感这个东西。他说他不希望带这样一个标签，也不希望因为这样一个标签给自己的作品或者自身有一个限制。我觉得可能每一个藏族作家或者藏族就是其他领域的艺术家，他可能都会有这样的感受。所以在自我的这个身份的认同上，我不会用这样一个比如说中国藏族导演这样一个身份来局限自己。我更希望就像阿来一样，我更希望作为一个作家，我希望别人称呼我作家乱马才旦。作为一个导演，我希望别人称呼这个导演乱马才旦，不要加上这样一个人为的这样一个限定的东西来局限你的东西。因为我自己写作或者拍摄电影，我的题材或者我设计的内容也不希望限定在那样一个范围之内。就像我拍摄藏族题材的电影，很多人问我你是拍给谁看的？首先他就问我你是拍给什么人看的？是不是你的电影只是拍给藏族人看的？我永远的回答就是我不是，我是希望所有的人都看懂我的电影。所以我在我的电影里面会打破这个界限。比如说你传达一个东西，可能在藏族地区这是一个家喻户晓的，就比如说这个第一部电影《静静的马尼石》里面，它涉及到智美根登，在藏区它是一个家喻户晓的人物，家喻户晓的故事，大家一说他的名字就马上会想到他的故事。但是你要考虑到作为一个电影，你要考虑到之外的观众，藏区之外的观众，比如说中国内地的汉族观众，或者你更远一点就是国外的观众。所以你会做更多的这个文化背景的这样一些交代。所以我在这个片子里面对这个智美根登这个藏戏或者这个人物，通过很多的情节或者细节的设置，做了一个基本的交代。就是看完这个电影之后，你对藏族或者藏族的文化或者这个藏戏智美根登完全没有了解的话，大家看了这个电影之后，也能了解它是一个什么样的剧情，然后也能大概能知道它体现的是一个什么样的精神。
I want to take us from this to our own translation exercise, and if this translation exercise fails, that could be just as interesting as if it succeeds. It's really the point of the question. I'm going to ask Evans to show us the clip he's chosen from 2 or 3 Things About Kanye West, one of his most recent films. But then I want to not ask Evans to translate that film, that clip, into meaning for us. I want to see maybe whether Pema will tell us what that clip means. And if he says nothing, that will be interesting. Evans, in one sentence, why did you choose this clip?
Yeah, okay. Why I want to show the, I apologize, it seems, longer than you expected. It's close to 10 minutes. When we are talking about translating from one culture to the next, I think that we have one assumption. We are identical to ourselves, we are ourselves. Or our history, you understand it is, you think that what it is. But I feel that when I grapple with this film, the subject Come Your Way, it was an accident. I don't have to go into it. I won't go into why I made that film. It's too complicated. But what I have come to the conclusion was, and especially because I'm sitting right next to a Tibetan director today, that was China the same? Was China really a continuous China? Was China the same as the kind of China you have today? So there was, for me, a rupture. The 1911 revolution was the rupture. And I think the way it was presented was really deceptive because a very important component of 1911 revolution, it was an ethnic revolution. It was racial revolution. But all we are talking about today is just to understand it as the evil of monarchy, and how much better we are by just getting rid of the monarchy. But there is a lot going on within the monarchy. And why was that at one time a project to try to retain the monarchy as part of Kanye West's project? And I was asking myself, are we? That was the great question posed by Hobsbawm, the great British historian. And now, are we being too nostalgic? Is it too good to be true? The old empire is more multicultural and tolerant than where we are today. And so that's why I want to show that clip, because even myself, I feel as though when I make 2 or 3 things about Kanye Way, I'm translating my understanding of that era into the kind of tools available to us today. And also I'm translating from the other end, because all these understanding of Chinese history is really not that available from within Chinese scholarship. I have to re-import that scholarship from the international, from the New Qing studies scholars in the United States, etc., back into Chinese, and for us to understand that era. So that's one reason I am showing that clip, the first 7-8 minutes of the film, and then we are talking about that era. And again, as I said, one thing about Kanye Way is, if that was the first student movement in China, the suppression of the 100 Days Reform was the original June 4th of modern China.
there was a chance to escape revolution. It didn't work. The idea of reforming the monarchy and really making it a constitutional monarchy in which the basic, like the British system, I mean, and like many systems in Europe, because in Europe we still have many monarchies and constitution, and it works. But that's history, and you can. It's no use to regret, because history is what it is. Right? China made a revolution, so you can have monarchies and constitution, and it works. But that's history, and constitution, and it works.
1911年，辛亥革命爆发，驱逐鞑靼，恢复中华，数以万计的满洲人被屠杀，满洲政府被推翻了。中国人经常说这是场不流血的革命，但其实清末时满洲人的人口大约是接近500万，而下一次人口调查在1953年，中国大陆的满族人口大约是250万。那究竟多少的满洲人是在革命中遇害，又有多少人隐姓埋名，避免被迫害
？Ethnos and nation, both come from the same root, and they both have this biological element in them as a very important component. So nationalism becomes very intolerant of the multinational political arrangement. I am of Turkish origin, and the Ottoman Empire, of course, was a multinational empire, and much more so than the Qing. To think of Turkey today, I mean, there were obviously in the late Ottoman one of the immediate consequences of the emergence of nationalism was the ethnic cleansing of Armenians, which the Turkish government refuses to recognize to this day. So that nationalism, the transition from a multinational empire to a single ethnos nation nationalism, is painful and exclusive.
被现代的汉族民族主义推翻排斥的满洲人，本来是关外的游牧民族。他们在1644年征服汉人之后，又取得了蒙古、新疆、西藏这些属地。但大清国的盛世在19世纪遇上重大危机。面对西方列强的坚船利炮，汉人对满族政府的不满越来越严重。当时，光绪皇帝希望能重振大清国，于是启用了一位来自广东、南海的汉族读书人康有为，在1898年进行了所谓百日维新。
恭喜圣安，一向精明强干，现在朕有一件非常重大的事，你愿意替朕去办？臣赴汤蹈火，在所不辞。
幸亏我命不该绝，天叫你瞎了眼，认错了人。 你以为袁世凯是真心这样的人吗？我告诉你说，他一到天津就把你给卖了。有我就没有新政。
变革运动立刻被暴力镇压。这不只是因为我们今天所说的新旧冲突，也是因为种族之间的冲突，满人对汉人的不信任。慈禧太后他们不信任康有为，说他的目标是保中国，不保大清。但他们不知道，康有为是最后的一位汉族人，给他们满族人一个把权力下放、免受暴力排斥的最后机会。康有为与他的弟子梁启超逃亡到国外，成立保皇会，华侨称之为中国维新会。保皇会相当是现代中国的第一个政党，目标是希望能以宗族立宪方式，既能够保存大清的多元文化的传统，又能和平地把中国现代化。
Pema, any thoughts? I had no idea what was in this clip when I proposed this, but what does Qinghai Wei mean to you as a Tibetan?
康有为其实对我来说是一个很熟悉的人物，就是因为我接受的这个教育的体系，你在初中的时候，大概在10几岁的时候，就会接触到康有为、梁启超这些人物，也知道百日维新是什么。但是我28号到香港之后，为了这次交谈，我专门看了田园琛先生的这个大同这个影片，确实，给了我很多的，跟以往不一样的思考吧。
This is a point in the evening where we've heard a bit from both our speakers, and we've seen a little bit of their work. We have other clips we could look at later if we have time, but I'd like to throw the event over to you, the audience, to see what questions and thoughts you would like to raise for the next 20 minutes or so. Do any of you have any thoughts, any questions that you'd like to put to our two directors? I see a question right at the back there. Maybe someone's coming with a microphone.
Thank you. I'd like to ask both directors, but obviously Evans, you being in New York, you're in a better position possibly to comment on this, because this is the concept, this general concept that there is the Oscars, which is for English language films, and then there are foreign films. And I'm afraid that perception seems to, that very damaging perception about cinema, somehow being the foreign films are the other, and the American films are the norm, if you like. And to what extent does that affect the way world cinema, and this, even the designation of world cinema, to what extent can reinforce that perception of there's the American film industry and then there's the other? To what extent do you think that your kind of films, in fact both of you as directors, suffer from that kind of paradigm, which is something that a lot of us who love film really dislike intensely?
Okay, I'll answer first. Yeah. I think. I think both of us are not exactly making very mainstream films. I guess his language, his film's language is in Tibetan in China. And of course, that's the reason for. Number one, there's a political expectation for his film to be translated into or to be dubbed into Chinese. But I think you all. Now these days they talk about the American independence, and in the case of Hong Kong, of course, it's the mass entertainment, is the so-called mainstream films, and you have both the Hong Kong film industry is very much a Hollywood model. So under the shadow of Hollywood, of course, all minority discourse suffer. And that minority can be not just ethnic, it's just, your social, political position, not exactly as position taking, but just, of bringing a different discourse and bringing a different kind of inquiry into cinema. Can cinema be more challenging? I think Pema's films are very challenging. Like this morning, I just watched Old Dog. I find it a very powerful film. And the last two shots are really pack a punch. In that sense, I feel that it's in the minority. But I think that you are in a fast-changing world, and that you are beginning to have more and more platform. Even cinema itself is old, is almost considered outdated. I just heard this description of cinema being this flat on the walls. So, just flat, it's so boring, you have to be flat on the wall, and people have to sit there, for whatever, how long. And people, or younger people today, just look at some clips on YouTube, and, that's good enough. And they want interaction, so film is just too dictatorial, because you cannot stop, unless you watch at home on the DVD, then you can stop and you can skip and all that. Otherwise, it's just too dictatorial. I think that Susan Sontag made a comment at one point very interesting. Toward the end of her life, when all these cyber fiction came into being, and then this fan fiction came into being, you go in and you decode, you slice the text and you construct your own text. And then she was saying, I never understand. She thought, well, I never feel that, I spend time working on that sentence is a form of dictatorship. So I feel that the same thing, you make the film, you spend so much time in editing it and presenting it, and then, is, something so boring, why should they sit through it? And why should, they follow it at your own pace, at the pace that you dictate to them? So I think that there are all these problems in terms of what an artist can accomplish. So I think that's just quite universal. But I think that, of course, Pema deal with a different problem, or less of a problem because of the interest in Tibet, I think.
Pema, what do you think about the dominance of American cinema that makes your cinema necessarily secondary?
Or the blockbuster films in China.
我觉得可能这个问题是在整个世界范围内存在的。就比如说美国电影、好莱坞电影，它可能会影响其他国家的，就比如说其他语种的电影的这个生存的一个空间。比如说我在美国也待过一段时间，可能一般的观众除了英语的电影之外，其他的电影基本上不看。就美国的一般的观众。 如果你去让他放一个就是带有英文字幕的这样一个外语片的话，他们会选择放弃。 美国也有很多，也有时候也会放一些，比如说汉语的电影、华语的电影，还有一些印度的电影。我也观察过他们这个观众的构成的群体，一般都是中国的电影90%都是就是汉语的观众在看，然后其他的可能有几个人就是学习汉语的，或者这样一些学者或者家属啊，或者就这样一些观众，确实它的构成是分类很明确。然后有些印度电影，我也去看他们的这个观众的一个构成，基本上是在美国生活的一些印度人在看。然后其他的可能一些，比如说在纽约的亚洲协会啊，或者一些 MoMA 呀这些，它确实会放一些其他语种的比较，甚至一些小语种的这样一些片子，他们的观众确实是比较复杂的。然后就是这种情况在中国也是，尤其在当下，就是随着中国电影市场的越来越发达，然后它的观众的构成也是这样。如果你要在中国的一个大陆的市场，你要想上映一部就是少数民族，尤其少数民族语言的这样一个小语种的电影的话，那是非常非常困难的。所以
全国放映的机会有多？是不是全国放映的？
全国放映的机会很少，很少。对，因为少数民族文化，我觉得目前它确实处在一个非常边缘的阶段。首先，你的这个文化，首先在文化上得不到关注，然后就是一个语种的问题。可能观众就是普通的观众，就像在美国一样，可能更喜欢直接看这个汉语的影片，因为看字幕确实是比较累的事情。可能因为英语的普及，大家可能会喜欢看一些，比如说美国的好莱坞的电影，在中国也是你去看那个观众的成分，他可能更喜欢看一些原版的，就是英文对白的这样一些电影，不喜欢看这个配音的电影。但是你要放一个少数民族题材的这样一个，比如说藏语的一个影片在电影院里面，那是确实是非常困难的，哪怕它是一个就是商业类型的电影，它确实也有困难。所以你必须得翻译成这个汉语配音，然后才有可能就是去在更广泛的这个场地去放映你的电影吧。所以我觉得，因为这个语言的限制，确实，对电影的制作或者对电影的整个的一个发展的前进都带来了非常大的一个局限。因为首先它是一个电影，它是一个工业嘛，它必须有一个投入。一旦你投入之后，制片人他就必须要收回这个成本。如果收回这个成本的话，他就会自然会考虑到这个市场，因为你选择的题材或者选择的这个语言，所以你确实是在现实的失去一些市场，这是一个挑战。
But I understand that, for example, Hong Kong cinema was popular at one time, even though it's supposed to be specialized. I think Barbara Shah at the Film Society, Chicago, she started showing Hong Kong films, and then, mostly Hong Kong action films, and they noticed that a lot of people, they got more audiences than normal. And then, of course, it's certain kind of Hong Kong film, and like Tsui Hark's Detective D, had a brief run. People like him. Then his first 3D film, Dragon Gate, was shown, and the moment the first line was spoken, and it's in Chinese, and there's some audience boo the film. They were not expecting to see a Chinese film, has to look at subtitle to see this action spectacle. So you have.
Ang Lee may be a special exception, a breakthrough.
Yeah, but then he switched to English quite a bit. Yeah, I mean, you are talking about Crouching Tiger. Crouching Tiger, yes. I mean, Crouching Tiger. Did have. I mean, more successful Chinese films. Crouching Tiger, then Hero, and the two action films by Zhang Yimou, or the more recent one from Wang Kar-wai, the Grandmaster. I mean, that get to a wider audience mainly because it's an action spectacle. Yeah, I think that Grandmaster is probably still is, that is a not full-fledged action, beautiful action pieces. So So yeah, I mean, like Chongqing Express is an action film, at least half of it, yeah, and that go over better than the other films that they make.
Let's take another question, please. Question there.
My questions are directed towards Pema. 现在在西藏匠人作为就是做电影的大概有多少人？你们做这种电影创作的时候，一般遭遇到什么困难？你自己从事创作的电影的时候，是在西藏还是在中国大陆？就是西藏以外的地方，还是在中国大陆以外的地方？另外最后一个问题是，你怎么看？不是西藏人做出来的电影，就是以西藏为题材或者是牵涉西藏的电影。
好，就是您的问题总共有3个，我觉得我倒着回答可能比较好。我自己从一开始到北京电影学习，然后后来到制作自己的母语电影，都是就是包括演员，就是第一部演员都是藏族人，然后他们说的是藏语，而且我也尽量希望在自己的这个创作班子里面，就是形成一个藏族的这样一个主创的团队。所以到第2部电影的时候，基本上包括摄影师、录音师，还有其他的一些美术师，都是一个藏族的成分。我这样做其实并不是为了强调那样一个藏族的身份，我觉得就是首先是需要那样一个基本的条件，然后你才有可能做出纯粹的藏族的电影。要不然可能就是录音师，如果录音师你不是藏族的话，你在录音的时候录一个人的台词的时候，他可能感觉不到那种情绪的变化。所以我必须就是我要求这个录音师，电影的录音师必须是藏族，他在演员讲这个台词的时候，你才能感受到那个情绪对不对，他传达的这个情绪对不对。这是一个基础吧。就是第一个问题，目前有很多藏族的年轻人希望从事电影或者影像的工作。大概在罗仁钦我们上高中的时候，可能诗歌是一个非常非常流行的一个创作的方式吧。可能很多人，比如说你问很多的年轻人你喜欢做什么，很多人都会说希望将来成为一个诗人或者一个作家。但是现在你问很多的年轻人，比如说中学或者高中或者一些大学的一些学生，甚至是一些寺院的一些僧人或者一些农民牧民，问他们可能会说，就是希望成为一个影像工作者吧。这个可能跟我的这个从事电影有关系，跟第1部电影就是《荆棘马尼石》这个片子有关系，因为这个片子很普及，对，是一个可能更直接的一个表达的方式吧。就像那个前面那个问题，虽然有这个语言的一些障碍，但是电影它作为一个特殊的语言，它可能有一个影像的一个基础，它形成了一个它是一个我觉得是一个世界性的语言，所以它可能会对传达有更便利、更优势于这个文字的这样一个功能。所以可能这个是很多在藏区很多年轻人喜欢做电影的一个喜欢选择或者喜欢选择做电影的一个原因吧。但是真正就是能了解整个的电影的制作过程，然后制作规律或者电影的工业的这样的人其实不多，可能最多影像的这些爱好者可能最多就是拿 DV 拍一下自己的一些生活的记录啊什么的，这种可能会比较多。我觉得在藏区电影作为一个文化要普及的话，我觉得还是有很多的事情要做。
我 补充，my question is, I seem to notice that most of your crew members are Tibetans. Is that the case? And is it because that maybe you're making the films in Qinghai, and of course there's Tibetan area, and most of them are Tibetan. Is that an issue of availability, and also what you emphasize about they will have better understanding of the drama because they are Tibetan, so you prefer to have a Tibetan crew? And how exclusively Tibetan have they been? And how 是不是全部都是drama？
对，我首先需要说明一下，就是其实电影是一个很多人在一起工作，然后完成的这样一个创作的一个过程吧。所以首先说明一点，我并不是所有的创作人员都是藏族的，其实也有剧组里面也有很多的汉族。我是说主要的一些创作的成分，创作人员的构成它是藏族，比如说摄影师，然后录音师，或者美术师。我觉得这些人员的构成对影片的一个内容的传达，甚至对美学的传达有一个至关重要的作用。我觉得可以就其他的，比如说技术人员，我当然可以用其他的，比如说汉族，或者汉族之外的，或者美国的、英国的、法国的电影制作者都可以。我觉得这个对这样一个集体的创作来说，他没必要那样去刻意的去要求。然后就是对制作的区域的问题，因为我自己是安多藏区的嘛，然后我写的剧本也是以安多藏区那边的生活为基础，然后创作的这样一些剧本，所以我拍摄的地点也基本上是选择就是到目前为止的4部藏语影片都是选择在安多地区拍摄。然后我希望在拍摄的时候，就是演员是藏族演员，然后也希望，因为安多虽然是一个比较统一的这样一个方言，但是它之间也有很多的方言的差别。所以比如说我第4部藏语影片这个五彩事件的时候，我基本上就是用的都是那个地区的，就是它是比较靠近农业区的，农业区和牧野区之间的它的方言虽然是安多方言，但是也有很大的差别。就是如果你懂的话，你能听出那种区别。所以我是尽量靠近那种就是语言的那种质感吧。所以我觉得我这些影片哪怕过了10年或者20年，将来即使没有了这个电影本身的意义，它还是有一些史料的价值。你可以从这些影片里面可以找到就是某一个区域的它的方言的一些特征，或者他们生活的一些习俗的一些不同于其他地方的一些特征。然后选择这些地区也是可能一个是我熟悉就是这样的生活这样的题材，然后另一个跟每个地区的特殊的这个状况也有关系。可能我在安多地区拍摄，可能比在西藏自治区境内拍摄有更多的便利。一方面我熟悉那个地方，然后另一方面可能在政治上也会相对宽松一些，可能更会容易实现就是自己的这个创作的一个要求。
然后找演员，sorry.
We're going to run out of time, so I need to offer the audience a chance. A question over there.
你好，我想问2个问题给Pema。第一个问题就是刚才你讲到，就是在你的电影里面呢，你不希望把它配音，当然有各种各样的客观的原因了。但是我觉得我也同意你说法，就是语言本身呢，它就是身份的一部分。另外呢，其实从电影里面呢，如果要是你用了配音的话，原来演员的这个声音就没有了。那我即使听不懂他说话，但是我如果听到他的声音，也可以在脑子里面形成一定的形象、一定的印象。但是其他的像那个汉族或者汉语的这些影片，像张艺谋他那一个不能留下，他也用的是方言，他也没有说让那些演员说那个标准的普通话，然后底下也是配着字幕的。那你觉得就是你的这种处理方法跟张艺谋就是这种汉语的，但是方言表达的，有什么实质上的区别吗？这是一个问题。还有一个就是， 你说你的那个片子从藏语翻成汉语呢，基本上都是你自己做，你觉得可以就是差不多把90%多的这个信息都表达出来。那如果要是换成别人做的话，你最担心的是什么？什么东西会损失掉？谢谢。
对，第一个问题，我觉得在本质上没有区别。它就是为了语言，它有一个天然的质感，尤其是方言，它可能比普通话，有更多的情感。就比如说一个方言，它可能用方言表达，它就能传达一些细微的。一些，比如说某一个地区才能有的那样一些感情的东西，但是你换成普通话那种感情的东西，那种感觉的东西，可能就会失去。所以张艺谋拍那个，一个都不能少，他用方言，我觉得也是因为这样一个原因。但是在中国，就是电影审查，就是电影制度，它是比较限制用方言来拍摄的。为了推广普通话，他一般都会鼓励用这个普通话来做这个对白。所以从这个角度讲的话，我觉得我使用藏语，然后其实也是一样，使用藏语。藏语有3大块嘛，就是因为区域的不同，它有安多，然后有这个拉萨，还有这个康区的。如果我拍这个安多题材的这样一个电影的时候，你用拉萨的方言，那肯定是不对的。或者，因为在国外，就是因为3大藏区的人在一起生活，然后在一起接触，它有一个就比较有点类似普通话的这样一种语言的形成。所以你在片子中用这种，比如说类似普通话的这个，它也会失去那个本来的那个质感。所以本质上我觉得没有什么区别。然后第二个问题。
你的电影里面从藏语翻成汉语，你都是自己做，然后
对，我知道了。我觉得对，可能我担心的就是语言中的那些质感的东西吧，因为我不知道有时候就是在中文翻译的时候，我会，比如说精简一些东西，可能在文学翻译的时候，我会尽量的传达，就比如说一个语言中的一些气息啊，或者就是一个节奏或者一个感觉，会尽量的传达那个原文的那个状态。但是在电影翻译的时候，电影对白的翻译的时候，我会根据那个情景，然后也会辅助的看这个，比如说一个演员他在表演状态中的那种肢体的语言。如果肢体的语言能够传达，或者他的表情能传达的时候，我可能会省略一些东西。这个可能就是我最担心的问题。所以我的电影的台词在翻译成汉语的时候，我是尽量自己做。
We've come to a point in the evening when we should give our speakers a break and allow you to go out and do strange things to celebrate the ritual of Halloween, which I'm sure you're all itching to do. We've had a number of concepts this evening that I'm sure will resonate for some of us. Evan's idea that the fundamental project in China's modernization, in any modernization, is a kind of translation of the question of the cosmopolitan that was so central to the early modernizers' efforts in China, that he's tried to show in his films, and that his films reflect in their multinational construction and multilingual, multicultural personalities and locations in them. And with Pema we hear this very fascinating thing that the Tibetan project that he's just told us is not just about identity, it's also about knowledge and about knowing something in your past. And I wonder if we're hearing something there about the Tibetan project being about speaking back to other Tibetans, not always about speaking to the other, to the Chinese neighbor or the international community. So I suppose we can see in their work and in all this work that there are many languages being spoken at the same time in any project, just as you hear their reference all the time to how the visual is a different kind of language that, particularly for younger people, translates much more readily, much more comfortably, or so they feel. And perhaps we can see in this conversation this evening the kind of multiplicity of levels in which meaning is being transmitted by their work, by all of our works, by you, particularly as Hong Kong people, working in many cultures at the meeting point of many ideas and many histories, some colonial, some your own histories, and many of them your futures. I think it's very apt and exciting that here this evening the University and Asia Society have asked us to put these ideas together. I see somebody at the back wants very much to ask a question. We should let her, I think. You've got a microphone there. We can use mine actually. This time.
I'll use English for this question. He just spoke about, this question is for Pema, you just spoke about that latest project, which I find really interesting, about using Fangyan. I myself spent some time in the Tibetan area and I learned a Fangyan. And I found that the tricky thing is, how do you make something in Fangyan but also contemporize it so that the Tibetans themselves want to watch it? Because when I was there, I was also doing some artistic projects, and I found it so interesting that I subsequently learned their language. But a lot of the locals found it very strange. Why would you want to learn this Fangyan? Only 3,000 people speak it. And in making a film like that, to me that sounds really interesting, but then for a lot of the population themselves, how would you contemporize that context of the film so that they would also find it exciting?
对，就是我目前为止拍摄的几部影片都是反映藏族当代生活的、当下生活的，反映他们当下的一个生存状况。所以我觉得就是你所反映的这个题材，或者你设计的这个题材，自然的就带有了自然就具有了当代性，包括语言也是。就是呢，即使我用的是安多方言，但是它因为生活在当下，所以它的语言就自然的带有了这个当下性，你没有必要去刻意的去限制什么东西。我觉得它就是包括当下的人，生活在当下的人，他说出的语言就很好的体现了他们当下的生活的一个生存的状态。然后
I would think my.
Let's have last word from Evans.
I think any minority artists always have to respond to that question, and yet every artist has to answer that question as well. I mean, why would you think that one day in Dublin is of interest to anybody? Well, I mean, we have a classic. And then just some time ago I read this novel in English translation. It's written in Catalan and praised by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. When she wrote it, the language was at the point of extinction. It may no longer exist after the Spanish Civil War. So I mean, I think that you're always taking a chance. And I mean, if you're serious about your art, I mean, you will take that chance.
Well, this is a conversation that doesn't want to die, I think. And we need to draw it to a close, and we need to do that by thanking our two speakers, by thanking Asia Society, Hong Kong Baptist University, Rob Nathan for organising it, and especially our extraordinary exponent in real life of translation, Jessica Yuen. Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you.